Hey, I'm back again, again, again. 2018, in all honesty, was not exactly my year. That's probably pretty well reflected in my, shall we say, infrequent upload schedule. I spent a lot of time trying to work things out in my personal life, and while in many respects I'm not quite all the way there, I've figured out a lot of things about myself in other ways, and I'm well on my way to being ship shape again, or whatever the term is. It certainly was a saving grace that there was a lot of great music that came out this year, a lot of which kind of became the soundtrack to my journey of self-reflection and attempts to better myself, and others that just helped break up the monotony of living in a late-stage capitalist nightmare. So these are my top 50 albums of 2018. There's actually a couple of EPs in there too, but don't worry about it. I've already put out one year-end list already, the bottom 10 albums of 2018, all that sweet garbage. And later this month, I'll be doing a live stream where I talk about the top 25 new to me albums of 2018, which were albums released anywhere from 2017 backwards in time that I listened to for the first time this previous year. So look forward to that. I'm going to breeze through the bottom half of this list pretty quickly so we can really get to the stuff that I think had the most personal impact on me this year. Pretty much everything on this list I would tell you to go out and listen to, even the honorable mentions that we'll talk about later. But yeah, just so this video doesn't wind up being a marathon, I'm just going to read the bottom part of the list here. There will also be a brief 140 character or less mini review of the album beneath the cover. So if you are interested at all in what the album sounds like or what I thought about it, you can just read that. You can pause the video at any point. Number 50, One O Tricks Point Never, Age of. Number 49, Eric Taxon, Punk. Number 48, MGMT, Little Dark Age. Number 47, John Hopkins, Singularity. Number 46, Sophie, Oil of Every Pearls on Insides. Number 45, Jonathan Barber, Vision Ahead. Number 44, Portal, Ion. Number 43, Playboy Cardi, Die Lit. Number 42, Sectioned, Annihilated. Number 41, Young Fathers, Cocoa Sugar. Number 40, Mitski, Be the Cowboy. Number 39, Ambrose Akinmusuri, Origami Harvest. Number 38, Jean Grey and Quelle Chris, Everything's Fine. Number 37, Tim Hecker, Kanoyo. Number 36, No Name, Room 25. Number 35, JPEG Mafia, Veteran. Number 34, Lucas Pino's No Net, Nonette, That's a Computer. Number 33, Black Thought, Streams of Thought, Volume 1. Number 32, Kids See Ghosts, Self-Titled. Number 31, Joey Small, Ultraviolet Catastrophe. Number 30, Anderson .Paak, Oxnard. Number 29, Ken Mode, Loved. Number 28, Pusha T, Daytona. Number 27, Walter Smith III, Matthew Stevens, Joel Ross, Harish Raghavan, and Marcus Gilmore, In Common. And number 26, Saba, Care For Me. So now let's get into the top 25, the stuff that I really feel was the cream of the crop this year. That made sense, right? So at number 25, we have a collaborative effort led by tenor saxophonist Joshua Redman alongside cornetist Ron Miles, bassist Scott Colley, and drummer Brian Blade under the name Still Dreaming. That's the name of the album, and also, as I understand it, the name of the band. I saw this group at Jazz Standard in Manhattan in January of 2016, so I think it's been safe to say I've been awaiting this debut recording from them for a pretty long time now, and it did not disappoint whatsoever. This is a tribute to an older group led by Joshua Redman's father, Dewey Redman, back in the 70s and 80s called Old and New Dreams, and it was Dewey Redman on saxophone along with Don Cherry on pocket trumpet, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Ed Blackwell on drums, and all of them played at some point with Ornette Coleman. So the group was pretty much a tribute to that old Ornette Coleman Shape of Jazz to Come style, and so Still Dreaming kind of takes that sound and combines it with a more accessible kind of hard bop sensibility. Joshua Redman continues to be one of my personal models as a tenor player. He just has this effortless control of his instrument that is super captivating to me. None of the other members of the band are slouches on their own instruments either. Drummer Brian Blade really brings this band to some interesting heights, and I mean, he just blows my mind on any recording he plays on. So if you're looking for something that's kind of Ornette ish, but maybe a little more inside the box, and then check this album out. Number 24 is one of the most captivating releases that this electronic musician has come up with this century. It's Aphex Twin's Collapse EP. Richard D. James made his return to the Aphex Twin moniker earlier, a couple years ago, with the release of the album Cyro in 2013. And while a lot of the stuff that he's come out with since making the Aphex Twin return has been interesting and pretty good, I don't think a lot of it has really stacked up to his work in the same style around the late 90s and early 2000s with albums like the Richard D. James album or Drucuse or but with this 5-track EP, I think he's really come through with his best overall body of work since making that return. This is only 5 tracks, rounding out at just under half an hour, but there's just so much in the way of meticulous sound design, textural manipulation through glitchy break beats and deep bass frequencies, and it really feels like Aphex Twin has updated himself for the 21st century while retaining that kind of late 80s, early 90s analog warmth. For a project that's only 5 tracks, I think this really has a lot going on that gives me the sort of full enjoyment of listening to like an LP length project from Aphex Twin, so for that alone, it makes the list. Next at number 23 is more of a traditional return to form for Father John Misty on this album called God's Favorite Customer. Last year, Josh Tillman released what was probably his most polarizing album under the Father John Misty name so far, Pure Comedy, and this was an album full of some biting sarcasm and satire aimed at the state of humanity in the year 2017. I thought it was a pretty accurate and often pretty funny reflection on a lot of the paranoia and complacency and existential dread that I and many other people were feeling at the time, and in many ways still do. But from a compositional and songwriting perspective, I don't always think he hit the same marks that I know he was able to with albums like I Love You, Honey Bear. It was still good enough to make my year-end list, but I was hoping that the next time around, Josh Tillman would come through with something that was a little less bloated and had more of a focus on really solid songwriting, and thankfully, with God's Favorite Customer, that's pretty much exactly what we got. This is maybe my favorite album he's released as Father John Misty so far. There's just a lot of really sticky melodies and really gorgeous 70s soft rock production and instrumentation. I'm also kind of glad he decided to rein it back in terms of the kind of overwrought social commentary of Pure Comedy, and even some of the kind of whinging, pretentious rambling of I Love You, Honey Bear. For as much as I love that album, his persona tends to get in the way a little bit for me, but God's Favorite Customer just feels so much more genuine, and maybe that's just because these songs come from a pretty dark place. They were mostly written over a 2-month period in which Tillman said that his life kind of blew up, to put it in his own words, but I think that just kind of speaks to the fact that, you know, sometimes suffering creates the most captivating art there is. This is a lot more of an immediately gratifying album than his previous efforts, and I think that was really the sort of thing that he needed to do after such a long career of doing the sort of, he called it the pretentious thing, so I hope he won't mind if I also call it the pretentious thing. And suffice to say, I hope he's in a better place now, and from the look of it, it kind of seems like it is that way, so good. Good for him. At number 22 is a record from a former underground hip-hop heavyweight who has made a transition into the mainstream with this album that was really well executed and extremely tasteful. I'm talking about the new Denzel Curry album, Taboo. Across this album's 3 acts, Denzel Curry kind of updates the southern trap sound that he was giving people on his previous albums like Imperial and the double EP 32 Zell Planet Shrooms, with more of an influence from conscious hip-hop and pop rap, and he explores a litany of lyrical subjects that are a lot more diverse than he's explored in the past. Stuff like depression and fame and the current state of hip-hop and American politics. The progression from more introspective things in Act 1 all the way to like these just crazy, insane bangers in Act 3. The last 2 tracks, Vengeance and Black Metal Terrorist, are just this incredible 1-2 punch. And overall, the album is just sequenced so well. There's this really tangible increase in intensity from start to finish that just keeps me listening the entire way through. Curry is a powerhouse on the mic as usual, and even pretty much all of his guest features knock their respective roles out of the park. I think it's fair to say with this album, Curry has really carved out his own lane and style and sound and persona, and I'm really excited to see how he expands on it from here. My pick for number 21 is possibly the most standoffish album of the year, owing to its dense sound design and its massive 8-hour length. I'm talking about Autechre's NTS sessions 1 through 4. I admire Autechre greatly for how they've been able to consistently innovate on whatever the accomplishments of the last thing they did were. I'll admit I've only made it through this album once, and it took me 2 days, but I'm not pulling your leg when I say I enjoyed pretty much every minute. The style of this album is pretty similar to what Autechre were doing on LSEC 1 through 5 and XI, so I mean, they've been doing this sound for 5 years, and even with those previous 2 albums totaling 6 hours and this new one totaling 8 and like 14 hours of live material that they put out a couple years ago, I'm still just super captivated by what they're able to do. I think that's just a testament to how Rob Brown and Sean Booth are just some of the greatest sound designers in their genre, with many of these tracks lasting anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes all the way up to like an hour in the case of the final track. There's just such a high amount of detail and everything that you're hardly left wanting anything more. And I mean, how could you possibly want any more than 8 hours of music? So, I mean, if you're thinking about listening to this album, be sure to pace yourself. I don't think Rob and Sean will be at all mad at you if you try to just like space it out. And I mean, if this is your first experience with Autechre, maybe don't make it be your first experience with Autechre, because I mean, it's just so unwieldy, and if you try and just kind of jump into this without knowing how they got to this point, you might find yourself a little bit dissatisfied. So this isn't just me trying to come off as some sort of purist, but I really think if you go all the way back to their early material with Incunabula and Amber and sort of listen all the way through their albums up to this point, you'll be much better prepared, and you might even understand why this album ranks so highly. For me, anyway. I don't know if it ranks that highly for anybody else except Oliver. Kicking off the top 20 is an album of delicate, tender, and sparse music from the Shinya Fukumori trio. This is an album called For Two Akis, or Akis or something. It's the debut album from this Japanese drummer as a band leader on ECM, with French tenor saxophonist Mathieu Bordenave, I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, and German pianist Walter Lang. This is a jazz album, but I think it's one that will have a lot of appeal to people who aren't necessarily into jazz in the first place. A lot of what makes this album really special for me is more in line with the sort of pleasure that I get from listening to post-rock or ambient music. The compositions here, which are either mostly written by Fukumori or derived from traditional Japanese folk melodies, are just so breathtaking in their simplicity, especially for a modern jazz album where it seems like it's kind of a pissing contest sometimes to see how angular you can make your melodies and how many chords you can fit into your tune. But the simplicity of these tunes really allows the 3 musicians in this trio to create just this music with a high degree of interplay and just this amazing sense of space. Fukumori's drumming is really more of a textural element on a lot of these tracks than it is a timekeeping element. He leaves the timekeeping mostly to the piano, actually. Instead, he just kind of interjects with these really gentle brush statements, and sometimes he picks up sticks for more of a traditional groove type thing. But my favorite moments on this album are the really quiet, kind of liminal ones where the time just seems to kind of float. And everybody in the trio is just sort of pulling these notes out of the air that feel like they were just there the whole time. I mean, all the musical choices that the trio makes here just feel so satisfying in their execution. Like I said, this is definitely an album that I think could appeal to quite a lot of people if they are lucky enough to stumble upon it. And I really hope this trio is able to kind of take what they've done here and innovate further in the future. Number 19 is what I would call another successful studio outing from one of the most polarizing bands in rock and metal music. This is Deaf Heaven's newest album, Ordinary Corrupt Human Love. After a fairly metallic detour from their black metal shoegaze sound on New Bermuda, I think it's safe to say that on this album, Deaf Heaven kind of swung the pendulum back into the center. It's not quite as heavy and brooding as New Bermuda, but it's also not that hyper bright sound that they gave us on Sunbather. Instead, what I think they've done is they've kind of opted to create something that's a lot more stylistically diverse than they have been in the past, and they were already pretty diverse. Their sound has incorporated elements of black metal, shoegaze, screamo, post-hardcore, and post-rock, obviously, but here I think they kind of bring in a little more from dream pop and 90s alternative rock, and even a little bit of blues rock that you can hear in some of the guitar solos on this album. The longer tracks here are some of the best that Deaf Heaven have ever come up with, especially Canary Yellow and Glint, and even a lot of the shorter tracks work pretty well where they haven't exactly done so on previous albums. I just really wish Chelsea Wolfe Wolf had that whole lead vocal on Night People. I wish she didn't have to share it, but that's just me being a Chelsea Wolf diehard, so ignore that. The point is that Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, while I don't really think it's the same artistic triumph that Sunbather was, I doubt they'll ever top that album. It's my favorite one of theirs and my favorite of the year that it came out. Ordinary Corrupt Human Love is just one of their most accomplished albums to date. Number 18 is an album that seems like it was created with the sole intent of underwhelming longtime fans of this band at every stage, from the promotion all the way up to the release, and yet for me and many others it kind of had the exact opposite effect. I now think of Death Grips' newest album, Year of the Snitch, as being one of their finest hours. In many ways, this album runs completely counter to everything that Death Grips has been in the past. A lot of their music has been distorted and blown out and in your face and confrontational, but Year of the Snitch is often a lot more subdued than that. Songs like Black Paint and Dilemma kind of harken back to that guitar-driven sound that they experimented with on Bottomless Pit and Jenny Death, but they're mastered way more quietly. Linda's in Custody kind of reminds me of the glitchy electronic production of Steroids or even the first half of The Powers That Be, and Ha 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 kind of calls to mind No Love Deep Web in a certain sense, but in both cases these tracks are far more sinister and a lot less kind of outwardly aggressive. When Death Grips released these songs as singles, as they did with nearly half of the album before it actually came out, the response from fans was pretty uniformly lukewarm. A lot of people felt as though the band had started to fall off, and Death Grips seemed to have even anticipated that reaction, with the last track of this album being called Disappointed. There's actually a lot of moments on this album where Death Grips kind of toy with their fans in this way, which is nothing new for them at this point. They're very fond of breaking the fourth wall. But I think this time they really decided to do so by leaning into their status as like a musical meme harder than they ever have. This is evident really in a lot of the production choices, which kind of feel avant-garde and eclectic, sometimes to the point of like self-parody. They even had DJ Swamp come in and like scratch up a bunch of really old vocal cuts from previous albums like Ex-Military and The Money Store. They even brought in the director of the first two Shrek movies to do a spoken word bit. I mean, if you really want to cater to the meme crowd, you say you got the Shrek director on your album and then everybody eats that shit up. Death Grips seem to be stuck playing this endless game with their fans where they say something on social media or they incorporate lyrics and musical choices that send fans into just this tizzy trying to figure out exactly what's going on. But I think Year of the Snitch's message is actually pretty clear, and it's that Death Grips might be an old dog at this point, but they love learning new tricks. Number 17 sees the return of Walter Smith III to this list for the third time, this time as the sole band leader on his newest album, Twio. So this is the third time he's on the list. The other two times that he was on the list were for the albums Origami Harvest and In Common, so you might be able to tell that I'm a bit of a fan. This album is a series of trio recordings in a sax, bass, drums configuration, which was something that Sonny Rollins pioneered early in his career in the late 50s. And many saxophonists, especially tenor players, have sought to kind of replicate that sound of having no chordal instrument in the group. It's really only something that you have to like listen to experience and understand, because having like no piano or no guitar in there, just instruments that are capable of playing single lines, really allows you to kind of free yourself up and make more creative decisions with harmony and melody and all that other sort of stuff. In Walter Smith's take on the trio format on Twio, you get it. He uses Harish Raghavan on bass and also Christian McBride on bass, and they appear on about half of the album each. And drummer Eric Harland, who is just a freak. There's also one track that's just sax and drums, and there's another that's just sax and bass with Christian McBride. And there's actually two tracks that feature Joshua Redman, so he's on the list for the second time, and those are kind of like twin tenor battles, of which there's also a long-standing tradition in jazz, coincidentally enough. The tunes on this album are all standards, or in the case of the final track, Contrafact, which is based on like Someone in Love, they're based on standards. And so, like many of the jazz albums that I tend to place on my year-end lists, a lot of this I feel might only really be appealing to people who are already fans of or even students of the straight-ahead jazz tradition. The other two albums that feature Walter Smith III on this list are definitely much more boundary-pushing and genre-bending, so you might wonder why the straight-ahead standards album kind of wins out over both of them. I'm a jazz musician myself, and so the only answer I really have for you is that, it's kind of a jazz nerd thing for me. I just love hearing new takes on really well-established standards. The coolest part of this album for me is hearing the difference in feel in the group when Christian McBride is in the group versus when Harish Raghavan is in the group. Christian McBride tends to kind of lock the group in the changes and in the time feel really solidly. He's just got one of the greatest walking feels I've ever heard in my life. And so if you listen to a track like I'll Be Seeing You from this album, there's just this unbelievably hip, like just quarter note feel throughout the entire thing. And it's just quarter notes, but it feels so good. Meanwhile, when Harish Raghavan comes in, his sensibilities are a little more freewheeling, and he kind of has this tendency of sort of undermining the typical conventions of whatever tune he's playing. One of my favorite tracks from this album is Nobody Else But Me, just for the sheer fact that, like, they just completely destroy the whole like 4/4 feel of it. You can count to 4 over and over while you're hearing it, and it never goes away. But if you just kind of sit back and turn your brain off and listen to it, it just, you don't you don't know what's going on. And when they kind of go out of it and they lock back in, it's just so freaking cool. So it's that kind of stylistic variance that really makes Twio one of my favorite jazz albums of the year. Next up at number 16 is one of the most inventive punk rock records I've heard all year. This is the second album from Idols called Joy as an Act of Resistance. This was my first exposure to Idols, and I really don't think I could have asked for any better of an introduction than what I got here. Their music is a raw and cathartic blend of post-punk and traditional punk and post-hardcore, featuring some amazingly catchy riffs and some of the most energetic performances I've heard on any album all year, especially from the main element tying all of this together, which for me is vocalist Joe Talbot, who has this incredibly emotional voice and these amazing, like, these are some of the best lyrics on any album I've heard all year. This is exactly the sort of album I needed to provide that kind of emotional release of the tension that living in the year 2018 just has sort of created in me. There are songs here that thoroughly dissect the problems inherent with sexist ideas such as toxic masculine macho posturing and beauty standards as perpetrated by modern media. There's also discussion of social phobias like anti-immigration sentiment in the wake of Brexit. The moral of Joy as an Act of Resistance, I think, is inherent in the title. It's just that joy, whether it comes in the form of self-love and self-acceptance or in the fostering of unity between people of different cultures and identities and backgrounds, is sometimes the best form of resistance that there is to the ills of modern society. I think that's hugely important for people to recognize, and with music this good, I think that message is going to reach far and wide. Idols are definitely on my radar as one of the freshest, most creative, and most relevant rock bands I've come across in a long time. At number 15 is a triumphant comeback record from one of the greatest doom metal and stoner metal bands of all time. This is the newest Sleep album, The Sciences, which was coincidentally released on 420, so blaze it. Although I've been a big fan of the work that the members of Sleep have gone on to do since they went on hiatus in 1998, like Matt Pike's band High on Fire, and especially Al Cisneros' band Ohm, there's really no substitute for the real thing, and I'm really glad we got new music from Sleep of this quality in 2018. This is an album which is packed to the brim with just these amazing, hypnotic, repetitive, heavy, crunchy riffs, and they're all delivered in that same fashion that they pioneered on their magnum opus Dope Smoker many years ago. But the key difference here is that all the members of the band have had 20 years of musical and personal growth, which have colored the trademark Sleep sound in some really unique ways. Al Cisneros' vocal style is more in line with his style in Ohm. Matt Pike's riffs kind of hint at that more intricate style that he developed with High on Fire. And Neurosis' drummer Jason Reuter has come in on this album to fill in for Chris Haikous, who has since retired. And his drumming shows a real to Chris Haikous' drumming, but he really brings his own kind of unique flavor to it as well that keeps this from being stale. And that's really what I like about this. Sleep sound older and wiser than they ever have, but their trademark psychedelic, spaced out metal sound has been brought in these really interesting directions. And I mean, it really would have been so easy for them to just kind of phone in a reunion record, but I'm really glad they decided to just keep moving forward as a group and keep doing subtly new and interesting things that are pushing them forward. And also, I mean, the Leagues Beneath single was just the icing on the cake. These guys still, after all these years, just sound like three stoners trying to make the heaviest music in the known universe, and that's exactly all that I could have asked for from a new Sleep album. So kudos. The record in my number 14 spot marks an incredible discovery from a well-established titan, one of the greatest and most revered and respected figures in any genre of recorded music throughout history. This is John Coltrane's Both Directions at Once, the Lost album. The release of this album caused jazz fans around the world to pinch themselves because it seemed so highly unlikely that any stone had been left unturned in the Coltrane catalog. And yet in 2018, here we have just an entire LP's worth of never-before-heard material. And not only is it from John Coltrane, one of the greatest saxophonists of all time, it's also from one of the greatest jazz quartets of all time, the Coltrane Classic Quartet of pianist McCoy Tyner, bassist Jimmy Garrison, and drummer Elvin Jones. These guys have been revered as one of the greatest groups in the history of jazz for decades, and their playing here is no less commendable than it has been even on their most respected releases. Stylistically, this collection of material kind of sits in between the sort of late 50s, early 60s accessible Coltrane material with like My Favorite Things and Giant Steps and Blue Train, and the more avant-garde tendencies that he began to explore when he signed to Impulse with albums like A Love Supreme, and even later with the free jazz of like Ascension and stuff like that. Both Directions at Once kind of acts as like a missing link between these two eras of Coltrane's career. A lot of the compositions here are pretty straightforward and feel like they could have fit in that earlier period when he was signed to Atlantic Records, but they're played with this really fiery and freewheeling intensity that's more in line with how the group was playing in 1963 at the time. Often Tyner doesn't play piano at all, and like I described earlier, the sax, bass, drum trio thing kind of comes to the forefront, and they really start to soul search, especially Elvin Jones, who kind of has this just amazing propulsion in his playing that matches the fury that John Coltrane is delivering perfectly well. So with Both Directions at Once kind of sitting in the middle, like My Favorite Things was released 2 years prior, and 2 years after this session, A Love Supreme came out. So in that way, I think the title, Both Directions at Once, is pretty telling of the content. With the power of 2020 hindsight, it really seems like Coltrane was being pulled in two different directions at this point, and hearing him and his classic quartet try and find the balance has led to music which is just as invigorating in 2018 as I'm sure it was in 1963. By pure coincidence, the album on this list sitting at unlucky number 13 is Beach House's newest album, 7. Lucky 7 at unlucky 13. I have no idea how that happened, but it did. Believe it or not, this was actually my first experience listening to a Beach House album from front to back, and I think I picked a really good one to start with personally. This is a really ethereal collection of dream pop tunes, each one as carefully constructed and breathtakingly gorgeous as the last. I tend to be a big fan of albums that really kind of immerse me in their production, and 7 does that amazingly well. There are just so many layers to the sound of this album, and every song kind of feels like it reaches this point where it's just totally massive, as if I'm just kind of swimming through it. It's sort of the feeling that they capture with the full album video visualizer that they put on YouTube. Very few albums were able to really take me to a new place the way this one did, so I have to give Beach House all the credit in the world for that alone. But all this amazing production would be for nothing if it wasn't backed up by some strong songs at the core of everything, and thankfully I have the issue with this album where I can't really pick a favorite song. It's like picking a favorite kid or something. I just cannot bring myself to do it. This was definitely just the comfiest pillow of bliss that I experienced in an album all year, and I'll definitely be returning to it more and more in the future to just kind of recapture that feeling again. At number 12, we have another pretty immersive album, but one that's a lot more sinister. I'm talking about Anna von Hauswolf's newest album, Dead Magic. A lot of people have been describing this album as neoclassical darkwave, and I consider myself a pretty decent music buff, but I'll level with you and just I have no idea what that means. All I know is that I enjoyed the hell out of this album. This is an album which is just menacing and brooding in its atmosphere, and it just sort of feels like the perfect union between like Chelsea Wolfe's music around the time of Pain is Beauty or Abyss, and the sort of later post-2010 experimental work of Swans, which, if you know me, you know I'm a sucker for that stuff, so of course I ate Dead Magic right up. Anna von Hauswolf's voice just kind of floats so ominously over these mysterious layers of organs and synthesizers and guitars, and it makes for just some really adventurous soundscapes. Often the results are thrilling and lively, but just as often they kind of leave me in this stunned stupor as these waves of sound just kind of cascade over my very being. Dead Magic is an album that to me feels really truly innovative, and perhaps that's just because I'm not familiar enough with the neoclassical darkwave genre. And if you are, then please tell me in the comments what bands and albums are the ones to check out so I may be enlightened. But this is really, nobody's making music like this right now. Considering this seems to have been Anna von Hauslof's breakout project, I can only assume we'll be getting much more occult ambient experimental rock coming out of her camp in the near future. Just shy of the top 10, coming in at number 11, is one of the most invigorating albums in metalcore this decade. And I know I keep saying invigorating when describing these albums, but really, what else can I say to talk about this album? It's Vane's debut album, Error Zone. Vane's sound is sort of an amalgamation of several different 90s metal tropes, mostly the kind of chaotic metalcore sound of Cave In or Coalesce or Botch, combined with a sort of weird alternative metal, even like a new metal thing inspired by early Mudvayne and Deftones and Slipknot albums. These sounds just fused together into this really manic whole, and for 27 minutes, Vane just kind of unload everything they have on you. 27 minutes might seem like kind of a short listen, but I mean, there's just so much packed into every song here that it really feels like such a cohesive experience. There's no shortage of tasty riffs and dive bombs and walls of dissonant noise and savage screamed vocals and breakdowns and all other manner of hardcore tropes that just kind of smash into another with reckless abandon. And they make for an album that really keeps me on my toes the entire time. There's even some momentary detours into like industrial music and progressive metal from time to time. So I think it's really safe to say that with Error Zone, Vane has just crafted one of the best debuts I've heard this year, and an album which is just super exhilarating every time I listen to it. So before we get into the top 10, I'm just going to do my honorable mentions as I do every year here, albums that maybe I listen to here and there, but not really enough to count them among my favorites, or just ones that just barely didn't make the cut over others because there's only so many spots to go around. I'm just going to kind of breeze through these since there's around 30 of them. There was just so much good music this year. So these are in no order other than alphabetical. Against All Logic, 2012 to 2017. Andre 3000, Look Ma No Hands. The self-titled album from Avondale Bowling Club. Between the Buried and Me, Automata 1 and 2. Converge, Beautiful Ruin. Cupcake, Epherise. Chris Dave and the Drumhead self-titled album. Wayne Escoffery, Vortex. James Ferraro, Four Pieces for Mirai. Fire, The Hands. Grouper, Grid of Points. Julia Holter, Aviary. Hop Along, Bark Your Head Off Dog. Ice Age, Beyondless. The International Contemporary Ensemble and Colin Curry Group's recordings of Steve Reich's Pulse and Quartet. Julian Lodge, Modern Lore. Brad Meldau, After Bach. Milo, Budding Ornithologists Are Weary of Tired Analogies. Mount Erie, Now Only. Nine Inch Nails, Bad Witch. Frank Ocean, Endless, which was an album that I did love, but I really consider it more of a 2016 release with a remaster and a physical release. Parquet Courts, Wide Awake. Bob Reynolds, Quartet. Jeff Rosenstock, Post. Vince Staples, FM. Tropical Fuckstorm, A Laughing Death in Meat Space. Tune Yards, I Can Feel You Creep Into My Private Life. U.S. Girls in a Poem Unlimited. Kamasi Washington, Heaven and Earth, and the Choice EP that was kind of buried in the physical release. Watain, Trident Wolf Eclipse. Weedpecker 3. Kanye West, Yay, and Eve's Tumor, Safe in the Hands of Love. Alright, so kicking off the top 10 here, we have an album which sees one of the most buzzed about acts of last year continuing to push their creative envelope in a myriad of interesting ways. I am talking about Brockhampton's newest album, Iridescence. 2018 was an incredibly tumultuous year for Brockhampton. They had multiple false starts when it came to following up the Saturation trilogy, of which the third album in that series was my favorite album of last year. First it was Team Effort, and then it was Puppy, and then it was The Best Years of Our Lives, and along the way they signed a deal with RCA, and they had to let a member go over sexual assault allegations. And I think having lost Amir Van really made the boys kind of rethink their MO as a group. So Iridescence is in a lot of ways a reflection of the constant ups and downs that Brockhampton went through as a group this year. Stylistically, it's more varied than any of the Saturation albums were, and it trends on that more experimental side that they really started flirting with heavily on Saturation 3. The production incorporates even heavier influences from industrial and experimental hip-hop and contrasts these with even more lush alternative R&B and 90s rock sections like they did on their last few albums. I even heard San Marcos on like Sirius XM's alternative radio station alongside AJR. There was only one single that got released before Iridescence dropped, and that was the track Jauvert, and I think that it was a very conscious decision to not do the whole like release a bunch of singles and then a big album thing. Because I mean, every Saturation album had all those singles, and a lot of people kind of made their own sort of Saturation experiences by sort of picking their favorites from each of the albums. And those were records that were really made to have like a pop rap appeal with really snappy hooks and like super infectious verses and rhymes and all that other stuff. But Iridescence, by contrast, is a lot more of a holistic album experience. Kevin Abstract even cited Radiohead's Kid A as an influence for them here. That was another album that, you know, no singles before the release, and it's really best experienced just front to back, same way as Iridescence is. A lot of these tracks just aren't structured in a way that would make them suitable for release as singles. I mean, some of them are, but a lot of times you're getting these very linear song structures. You'll have songs that have multiple hooks in them, so not a whole lot for listeners to really grab immediately onto. The response to this was pretty obviously divided among fans, right? A lot of people that I've talked to kind of felt like Iridescence was a major step backwards for the group, but I don't really think they've gotten enough credit for what they did here. Iridescence is basically a musical and even lyrical kind of mosaic. There's a lot of verses about the usual Brockhampton subjects that we got on Saturation, but also there's a lot of introspection on the band's rise to popularity and the way the media has kind of obsessed over them, especially in the wake of Amir's departure. It seems like with the change in personnel, every member of the band has just expanded their role in some really interesting ways. And I think they really are starting to come into their own as individual artists and as a boy band. This is apparently the first part of a new trilogy of albums, which are going to be collectively titled The Best Years of Our Lives. And if this album is any indication, I think those eponymous years are only just beginning for Brockhampton. Next at number 9 is an album from one of Impulse Records' most recent signees and one of their most exciting recent signees. An album that says a lot with very little in the way of instrumentation. I'm talking about the new Sons of Kemet album, Your Queen is a Reptile. This is an album that combines jazz with a lot of different other African styles of music from around the world, including Caribbean dub and reggae, as well as West African Afrobeat. A lot of the melodic and harmonic core here is just provided by bandleader and composer Shabaka Hutchings' tenor saxophone alongside Theon Cross's robust tuba. There's also a litany of percussion coming from all sides of the stereo field from this band's revolving door of drummers. There's like 2 drummers on every track here, so there's just so much happening, and I feel like if this album doesn't entice some sort of movement out of you, you don't have a pulse. These grooves are just so infectious and deep and invigorating. There I go again saying that word, invigorate. But it's not as if this unique blend of styles doesn't serve some sort of larger purpose. The track titles all champion the influence and achievements of Black women throughout history, and taken in combination with the album title and the spoken word passages that appear on some of these tracks, what we have here is a stirring condemnation of the imperialism of the British Empire, and specifically the British monarchy and the crown, who the band sort of feel do not speak for Black people around the world, who don't see Black people as human. And so what Your Queen is a Reptile really does is it upholds the indomitable spirit of Black people around the globe in the face of these repeated attacks on their very being through British colonialism. And it does so through some of the most provocative music I've had the pleasure of listening to all year. Switching gears to something a little less politically motivated, at number 8, we have a collaborative album between 2 modern indie titans that I feel like a lot of people didn't give the time of day, but maybe that's just the part of me that's a Justin Vernon superfan talking. I'm talking about the debut album from Big Red Machine. This is a joint effort between Bon Iver's Justin Vernon and The National's Aaron Dessner. I try and keep up with all of Justin Vernon's side projects because, I mean, his work with Bon Iver has made them one of my favorite bands, and it's made Justin Vernon one of my favorite songwriters and performers and producers and musicians living today. And I mean, he's got a lot of these side projects to keep up with, but I keep coming back to them because, I mean, no matter who he winds up collaborating with, the results are usually worth listening to, like with Volcano Choir and with Gangs. But with Big Red Machine, I think he's really created something that gives his work with Bon Iver a run for its money on some days. That's not to take anything away from Aaron Dessner, since The National is also one of my favorite modern bands, and Aaron Dessner is their main songwriter, so really, I mean, both him and Justin Vernon deserve equal amounts of credit in how great this thing is. Their collaboration here is pretty far and away from whatever they were doing on Dark Was the Night with the song Big Red Machine that appeared on that compilation, which was more of an ambient piano ballad than anything else. but here what we have are some really electronically tinged pop songs that often remind me of the direction that Bon Iver took with 22 A Million, but with less of that kind of rough around the edges feel and a lot more polish. The instrumentation is just as eclectic in some spots, owing to the laundry list of collaborators that Vernon and Dessner brought in from their People platform. There's a lot of just really great and beautiful details in these songs here, and they're all topped off with that Bon Iver falsetto that I just can't seem to get enough of. This Big Red Machine album has easily become my favorite thing that Vernon or Dessner have made outside of their respective bands, and for that reason alone, I just really hope it doesn't wind up being some sort of one-off. At number 7 is a fairly recent release that nevertheless managed to take Brockhampton's spot over for my favorite hip-hop album of the year, which when Iridescent dropped, I said foolishly that would never happen, but if anybody's going to dethrone America's boy band, it might as well be Earl Sweatshirt's magnum opus, Some Rap Songs. This album sports 15 pretty short tracks, and it totals just under 25 minutes. That doesn't really seem like it would be a whole lot of time to create a fulfilling artistic statement, but in that 24 and a half minutes that this album runs, Earl packs in a lot of really small details. Every track here just has something interesting going on at every second. Earl's verses on these tracks are some of the most layered and intricate of his entire career. His technical ability has not wavered whatsoever. If anything, he's only gotten better at just creating these really complex rhyme schemes and working in some really interesting wordplay. But none of that seems to have gotten in the way of his ability to communicate some really serious emotions to his listeners. He's always been known for having a penchant for darkness and moodiness and melancholy, and the topics here range from depression, anxiety, substance abuse, rough relationships with family, all that stuff that he's talked about before. But the main difference really lies in the music itself. I think Earl has really started to go in a more experimental direction in the style of the Solace EP that he put out right after his previous album. The beats here are just this kaleidoscopic barrage of lo-fi sounds that loop lethargically underneath his rapping, which sounds more weathered and despondent and paranoid than it ever has before. This is easily the most emotionally cathartic and musically boundary-pushing thing that Earl's come out with so far, and with the passage of time, I might even call this a masterpiece. I think this is probably the best thing that anybody who was at any point a member of Odd Future has ever made, and I'm even including Flower Boy in that. Coming in at number 6 is my favorite jazz album of the year, a mammoth 78-minute collection of 12 tunes originally released once a month in 2015 as a series of chambered duo music videos on YouTube, and now they have been updated for a jazz quintet setting and working in influences from modern post-bop alongside folk, fusion, pop, contemporary classical music. I'm talking about Ben Wendell's newest album, The Seasons. The original Seasons videos were my initial introduction to the world of Ben Wendell, and after diving back into his work with Kneebody and his earlier releases as a band leader and all of his other projects like the Standards with Friends video series, he's really solidified himself as one of my favorite working saxophonists and composers in his scene today. In the transition from those online videos into a proper studio album, it really feels like The Seasons has just kind of come to life and blossomed in this really interesting way. The band that Ben Wendell puts together on this album is actually entirely made of partners of his who were in the original Seasons videos, including guitarist Gilad Hexelman, who was featured in the October video, pianist Aaron Parks, who was featured in the November video, Matt Brewer, bassist, who was featured in March, and drummer Eric Harland, who was featured in April. And this is a quintet of just all-stars who effortlessly make some really incredible moments happen on all 12 of these tracks, with Wendell's ear for intriguing melodies and harmonies serving as the blueprint for it all. I think I also said this about the Shinya Fukumori album earlier in the list, but this is an album that I think would have far-reaching appeal to people who aren't jazz fans in the first place. Sonically, The Seasons pushes a lot of boundaries that other albums made with acoustic instruments in a jazz style simply don't push. And in some ways, it's hard for me to think of this as just a jazz album. It uses jazz instruments, but the resulting music feels so untethered from that whole conception. It just kind of feels like the same thing I get from a Pat Metheny group album from the 90s, where there's just this universal kind of user-friendly appeal that you don't really need to necessarily be interested in jazz in the first place to really get. Suffice to say, I think this is Wendell's finest hour as a band leader, and this is just one of the best jazz albums I've heard all decade. 80 minutes long and not a moment wasted. It's really coming down to the wire now. At number 5, we have my favorite metal album of the year, a record which combines the math rock and post-hardcore and metalcore of this band's previous work with a really serious, progressive, and forward-thinking mindset. This is the new Rollo Tomasi album, Time Will Die and Love Will Bury It. This was an album that shot really far up my list at the 11th hour because I was writing this script and I decided to go back and listen to some of these albums again just to see if I wanted to change their order or anything like that. And Rollo Tomasi was sort of sitting around number 15 or something like that, and right at the very last second, that next listen I gave it, it just clicked really hard and it shot really far up the list. So now it's all the way up at number 5 and my favorite metal album of the year, as I said already. This was a really close competitor with another album that I'll talk about later for just my favorite cohesive album experience that I had all year. Every song on this record flows one into the next, kind of like Between the Buried and Me's album Colors, if you're familiar with that. But whereas Between the Buried and Me are more fond of a sort of everything but the kitchen sink or everything including the kitchen sink type of songwriting, Rollo Tomasi instead opts for something a lot more concentrated and focused in terms of the arc of the album and the way it kind of moves from consonance into dissonance and then like a juxtaposition of the two on the way back out the other side. There are just so many amazing moments on this album's 53-minute runtime that really tastefully combine those elements, and especially on the 3 tracks that pass the 7-minute mark, which are just such a masterclass in how to write a long-form song and keep it interesting the whole way through. It's albums like Time Will Die and Love Will Bury It that make me confident that metalcore still has a lot more directions to go in before we inevitably reach peak brick wall. I think Rollo Tomasi has really hit on something incredibly special here that just checks off all the right boxes for me. It's just so uniquely visceral and all around just unbelievably spectacular. My pick for number 4 is an album which, as far as I can tell, mostly garnered its fan base and acclaim thanks to the good people over at Rate Your Music. It's an album called Crumbling from a one-man South Korean project called Mid-Air Thief. This is easily the most gorgeous album I've listened to all year. It combines these layers of lush synthesizers and crisp acoustic guitars and soft, playful vocals, and it just creates this really highly detailed musical landscape with plenty of bells and whistles oozing from all sides of the mix. Even among other folktronica artists and albums, this is one that stands on its own as something truly unique as a listening experience, and I think a lot of that just comes down to the songwriting. These chord progressions and these melodies and these harmonies are just so unbelievably genius, and the contrast between songs that are constantly pivoting away from the expected move with these other songs that are more of a gradual development of a single idea, it makes for an album that's just unpredictable and super refreshing to listen to every time. I don't know what it is, but even in my minimal exposure to music of South Korea, artists like PJ and even some of the K-pop that's coming out of there, it just sort of feels like a lot of artists in South Korea are really ahead of the curve in terms of people in the West, in terms of their harmony and their songwriting and their melodies and everything like that. Crumbling is an album that's just dripping with creativity in this way in all musical aspects, and I really hope it's acclaimed by a bunch of nerds on the internet like me, puts even more eyes on Mid-Air Thief in the coming years. So last year, Brockhampton's first 2 Saturation albums were pretty much the sound of my summer. And at number 3, we have the album that was the sound of my summer this year. This is the debut album from Serpent with Feet, Soil. This is alternative R&B at its most emotionally potent and musically inventive. The only way I can really think to describe what's going on here is that it's an equal, like, kind of 3-way meeting of gospel music, Bjork, and Frank Ocean's Blonde. It's a strange and sometimes demented blend of woozy, mellow, and futuristic production, coupled with some incredibly raw and impassioned vocals from Josiah Wise, with this odd, quivering vibrato and some of the most emotionally vulnerable lyrics I've heard all year. Never have songs about being in and out of love sounded so eerie, but also so sensual and romantic at the same time. It seems kind of difficult for me to really fully explain the appeal that this album has to me that would rank it so highly on this list, but I think it just hit a really personal note with me that I really don't think many albums have in a long time. 2018 was a year where I really started to kind of come into my own and feel like I was able to live somewhat comfortably as a queer person, as an openly queer person. So it was albums like this and the one that I'm actually going to talk about next, but that's a spoiler. It was albums like these that really kind of helped instill that sort of comfort in me. This is easily my favorite debut album all year, and it has me incredibly excited for whatever Josiah Wise decides to do with Serpent with Feet in the future. So, speaking of music that helped me come to terms with my queer identity, at number 2 we have an album that held its reign as my album of the year for a damn long time, but it got knocked out like right at the last moment, pretty late in the year, actually, like maybe 2 months ago or something like that. I promise it's nothing personal. I'm talking about the new Car Seat Headrest album, Twin Fantasy Face to Face. So I said earlier that I would have put Frank Ocean's Endless on this list if it wasn't for the fact that that was technically a 2016 album that just got a remaster and a physical release this year. You might well be wondering then why I've decided to put this album so highly on the list, or even on the list at all, considering that it is ostensibly a re-recording and reimagining of an album from 2011, which has since been renamed Twin Fantasy Mirror to Mirror. So let me explain my reasoning here. The experience for me of listening to Endless in 2018 is not really all that different from listening to it in 2016, other than the fact that it got a remaster and now it actually sounds quite a bit better than it did before. But the content is essentially the same. The difference with Twin Fantasy Face to Face is that there is just so much reimagining and rewriting and recontextualizing of the original material that it feels like a completely different album. I've come to love both Mirror to Mirror and Face to Face pretty well equally, but for different reasons. The original was recorded by a 19-year-old kid on a laptop in Virginia, and it sounds like it was recorded on a potato, but the songwriting and the emotion is just so raw and genuine and real that it really helped to put eyes on the Car Seat Headrest name in the first place, and it led to that kind of snowballing of fame that allowed Will Toledo to actually get a record deal with Matador and put a band together and actually create Face to Face in the first place. So Face to Face not only dramatically increases the fidelity of the material here with the re-recording, which gives a lot of these songs a lot of the sonic depth and mass and largeness that I think Will Toledo was going for the first time around, but there's also songs with updated lyrics, songs with wholly new instrumental backings, and some songs that have had entirely new sections written for them as well. But I think what really sets this apart from Mirror to Mirror for me is just the thematic content of the album. Not only is this an album about an uncomfortable, gay, furry teenage relationship at the core, but also there's just these new overtones and themes about how art and the things we create change over time as we become less attached to them, or perhaps just more attached to different aspects of them that we didn't see there before in the first place. Face to Face is much like Mirror to Mirror in that it is an incredible emotional and musical roller coaster, and it actually does win out for my favorite overall album experience that I had with any record this year. But there's just this added layer of depth to the meanings and the music this time around that I think make Face to Face Car Seat Headrest's finest moment as a band so far. I can't say enough good things about it, but there is one more album to talk about. We have come to the end now. I'm not going to mince words this time around. I'm just going to tell you that my favorite album of 2018 is You Won't Get What You Want, the fourth album from Daughters and their first album in 8 years, though you might not be able to tell that if I hadn't told you. This band left us on such an amazing high note with their self-titled album in 2010, which was supposed to be their last album. This is one of the noisiest and heaviest noise rock albums I've ever heard in my life. For as great as this album is, though, it always left me wanting a little more, considering that it's only 28 minutes long. I just wish there was slightly more meat on the bone than what we were already given sometimes. So on You Won't Get What You Want, an album which is nearly twice as long at roughly 48 minutes, Daughters have taken the best parts of the sound that they cultivated on the self-titled, these impenetrable walls of dissonant guitars and Alexis Marshall's howling vocals and these weirdly infectious rock grooves, and they've turned them into something a lot more menacing and calculated and ugly, with far more of a pronounced influence from industrial and no-wave music, which gives the sound that Daughters were working with, which was already super demented, an added sense of weight and gravity and propulsion. In brief, this album is pure hell. It's the soundtrack to every paranoid, anxious, and panicked moment I've ever felt, and yet, weirdly, the music doesn't elicit any sort of negative emotional response from me at all. If anything, there's sort of a weird euphoria that comes from being pummeled by this music so frequently. There are moments of reprieve which were not present on the self-titled, but I think that's just mostly because they have to be there, because as much as I love just being battered and beaten over the head with this music, I don't think a straight up 48-minute battering would have been the wisest idea, so I'm glad they decided to let it breathe a little more, and they've created something here that's easily their most dynamic record to date. It's not quite as oddly danceable as the self-titled album was, but there's more than enough here in terms of just thrills and sheer terror that I really don't mind at all. They've really just created a different experience here. This is beyond a shadow of a doubt the greatest comeback album I've heard all decade, and I really hope it is fondly revered in the future as just a classic of underground rock music. So there we go. That was the top 50, the longest one of these lists I've done so far, so hopefully this video doesn't wind up being a marathon or anything like that.
I'm so sorry.
Let me know what your favorite albums were. Put like a top 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, however many you can fit or think to fit in the comments below. I'll probably follow this up at some point with a video of like albums that I missed out on this year that I meant to listen to, because there's always just so many of those every year, you know what I mean? But for now, these are the 50 that captured my attention the most. I'm going to try and upload a lot more in 2019. I can't promise you that there will be a whole lot of political content from here on out. I'm really going to try and kind of make a pivot towards subjects that I feel like I'm more studied in and that I have more of a valid kind of take in. So expect stuff like essays on music theory and album reviews and stuff like that in the future. So, I mean, if that interests you at all, I really hope you stick around. I will probably still be making a couple tips of the hat here and there to my bread tube roots, but I really hope you're not that jaded with the direction that I wind up taking in 2019. So yeah, I will see you guys all later. Stick around for that New to Me albums live stream, whenever the hell that winds up being. Subscribe, Patreon. I haven't done this in a while. I'll get better. Stay legend.